and welcome to the Joy of Cooking podcast. Each week, we set the table for a discussion about recipes and stories from the authors of The Joy of Cooking, Kitchen Victories, and Misadventures, and most importantly, what we are cooking and eating right now. We're glad you've joined us at the table today. I'm Shannon Larson, home cook, ardent Joy of Cooking user and fan, and roasted fennel enthusiast.
I'm Megan Scott, co-author of the 2019 edition of The Joy of Cooking. I'm a food editor by day and avoider of dish duty by night, and my farm in Stardew Valley is thriving.
I'm John Becker, fourth-generation co-author and steward of The Joy of Cooking, America's oldest family-run cookbook. I was busy making cheesy scrambles for house guests, and so I cannot think of anything snappy to say about my bio.
That's okay. Apparently the eggs were really good, so I think it's fine.
I got a pat on the back. It was good.
We have house guests, so we're, dealing with cooking for more than just the two of us.
It's weird, right?
It's kind of weird. It's just not normal for us.
It's fun, though.
Yeah.
Less leftovers, but that's okay.
Yeah. My sister is not a fan of eggs. She doesn't eat eggs, and that's our primary breakfast.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, what do people eat for breakfast?
What does she eat for breakfast?
We had bagels.
Oh, okay.
So like bready things and
Well, that's not
yogurt
the
and stuff.
worst.
Yeah, it's fine.
I'm also mostly egg-based in the morning, so I'm just like, weird.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, her fiance definitely a fan of eggs, so I think that he wanted to get something he doesn't usually enjoy. So
Nice.
I obliged.
Shannon, what have you been up to this week? Have you cooked anything delicious?
I included roasted fennel in my intro because, I've always liked fennel, but recently I feel like we've just been putting it on sheet pans way more often than we used to in the past, and it's so freaking good. Like, I don't know. It's delicious, and there's something about roasting it that makes it really, I can't even describe it. It's just rich and
I love
yummy.
fennel. It gets this nice texture when it's roasted. That I really like.
So we paired that with like some roasted chicken thighs, and then I was also wanting something really light, so I did a citrus and burrata salad with like crushed pistachios.
You sent a picture. It looked so good.
It was really good. We used grapefruit and blood orange, and it was nice to pair that with like a big roasted. The main meal was roasted, and then you had something fun and light.
I imagine that, you incorporate the roasted fennel into that salad. It would be pretty amazing.
Well, now you tell me. I'll have to make another one this week.
Yeah.
Darn.
Drat.
I know. What about you two?
Well, we were out of town for part of the week, but the one thing I wanted to talk about was this book that I can't stop thinking about that I finished reading this week called North Woods by Daniel Mason. And I kind of went down this rabbit hole because part of what the book is about is like someone who finds this unique variety of apple that is like the best tasting apple they've ever had. And then they propagate it and grow it in an orchard and then sell it. But it's in the book, it's called Osgood's Wonder, which is apples just have like such great names.
I love it.
But I wanted to look it up and see if it was based on, because it's a fictional book, but it's see if it was based on a real apple. And I kind of went down this apple rabbit hole I found one called Osgood's Favorite, which is almost completely gone from the face of the earth. It was found in Massachusetts in the early 1800s. And I found this really cute small town web page from a town called Southborough, Massachusetts. And in 2016, there was a blog post where someone was talking about how the last Osgood's Favorite tree, they were going to graft it and try to propagate it again and like you had to pay for them, but give the little saplings to people in the town to grow this apple that's almost completely gone. I couldn't find an update on whether they had followed through with it or not, but it's a really beautiful apple. And now I'm like, I have to try this apple. So I guess I have to go to Southborough, Massachusetts.
I wouldn't mind going out to Massachusetts. Let's do it.
Yeah. Leaf season.
There is something both tragic and also, I don't know, very compelling about varieties of anything really that people have just eaten too much of to the point where they're almost gone. It's like silphium or laser pitium. It's this spice that was around in Roman times, and they basically ate it until it was all gone. It's kind of
hard to imagine.
Kind of related to asafoetida, but yeah, I guess that's like the not as good relative of.
Wait, what kind of spice is it? Like,
well, I imagine it's kind of like asafoetida. It's just kind of got a savory, oniony, garlicky funkiness to it. But yeah, again, it's hard to say since none of it's left.
And no one alive has tasted it, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much.
Crazy.
But yeah, what else did we do? We did Szechuan hot pot for Valentine's Day by the fire.
You guys were just sweating.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So romantic.
It was toasty.
So cute. I love it.
We were eating it in front of the fire, so we were at the coffee table.
Yeah.
With hot pot, you have like a platter of different kinds of meat and then a platter of vegetables. And the cats were just like, you have chicken in there. I know you have chicken. But we couldn't give them any because it was too spicy.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Sad.
guys.
We would like to welcome Dr. Julia Skinner to the podcast. Dr. Julia Skinner is a food writer whose work includes the award-winning book, Our Fermented Lives. She also runs Root, a food-focused community and consulting organization offering classes, consulting on creative projects, a weekly newsletter, and more. She's also the founder of Roots and Branches, where she coaches other writers to help them find their voice and share their most important work with the world. Julia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
What have you been cooking or making lately that you're most excited about?
Oh gosh, I just finished working on my next book.
Ooh, congrats.
Thank you. Which is many hundreds of pages of food preserving recipes. So I have been canning things like crazy. And I always am fermenting things. That's kind of my core state of being is constantly fermenting food, but I'm also canning more right now. I recently made pastrami smoked pickled beets, which is very good. Yeah, it's probably my favorite thing I've made recently.
Yeah, that sounds excellent.
You're smoking the beets and then take it that there's a brine with kind of the typical pastrami spices in there?
Yeah, and I just smoke the beets long enough to get some of the flavor so they're not super mushy or anything.
Nice. That sounds wonderful. How many ferments do you have going right now?
Can't see the shelf from here, but probably about 100.
Whoa.
Like
Oh my God.
Just a few.
How do you keep track of all of them? Do you have like a spreadsheet or something where you track timing and all of that?
Yeah, that would make too much sense. I have labels on all of them with masking tape, and I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants with it and see how it goes.
Fun.
I kind of love that approach to fermenting because it is a more organic, it's a very organic process. It's not as linear as like normal cooking. So you can kind of just keep fermenting things and keep tasting them until they taste like the way you want them to.
Yeah, and it's nice because it's such an intuitive practice. Like, it's not like with canning where it's like this has to be done for this amount of time in this certain way to be safe. I mean, fermenting, as long as you do it, and follow the best practices, if I make sauerkraut that's 2 weeks old versus 4 weeks old, both are delicious in their own ways. Mm-hmm. So it's just what I want.
Yeah, I love that with kimchi as well. Like, I love the difference. Like, getting a fresh batch of kimchi is so good, but then it's a totally different experience if you wait a few weeks, and both are just, I can't pick a favorite. They're good for different things. So, Julia, you're based in Atlanta, right?
Yeah, I live in Atlanta, and then starting later this year, I'll be living half-time also in Southwest Ireland. So,
okay. Wow, that's so awesome. What made you want to live in Ireland part-time?
It's kind of a convoluted story. I had this dream several years ago that was like, go to this small town in Ireland that you've never been to, and I woke up and I was like, okay. And so I went to the small town in Ireland that I had never been to called Skibbereen, and had a grand old time, and was in Cork City after that and met friends and ended up meeting the guy that I ended up marrying last year. So he's Irish, born and raised in Cork. So through a series of events over the course of several years, it came to pass that now I'm going to be living there half the year.
That's really exciting. I'm curious, how do you eat in Ireland compared to in Georgia? Do you find yourself eating differently or cooking differently?
In my kitchen in Ireland is comically small. I mean, my kitchen Atlanta isn't massive, but I at least have more than like 1 foot of counter space, so that's something. So there I tend to, here I can kind of do more prep and spread out a little more, and there I have to be a little more conscientious of how many bowls and pots and pans and things I have going at once. So I tend to do more one pot kind of things there.
Mm-hmm.
Ingredient availability depends in the two places. So, here in Georgia, I can get really good citrus. You can't really get that good of citrus in Ireland. And there's other ingredients that just, I don't know, maybe you can find like, peanuts to make boiled peanuts or something there, but probably not.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really have raw peanuts, but they have really good dairy. So it just depends.
Yeah.
It's difficult to find raw peanuts pretty much anywhere except
the South.
around where you are.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, trying to test recipe. We added a recipe for boiled peanuts, and yeah, it was difficult to get a hold of the right stuff.
Yeah, interestingly, we're more able to find young peanuts or not completely dried peanuts at like Asian markets here. We were lucky to visit Vietnam last year, and fresher peanuts were a thing. And so you can find them sometimes at Asian stores, but otherwise you just cannot find them here. They're not appreciated as a foodstuff, really, which is unfortunate because they're delightful.
That's a shame.
There is a boiled peanut pop-up here, though.
Wait, what?
Yeah, I think that they have some packages for sale at a market way in Southwest Portland / Beaverton, Aloha area. But yeah, we should investigate.
Yeah, we should. That sounds mysterious. I was curious. So you're not from Georgia, correct, Julia?
Correct. Yeah.
Are there any Georgia foodways that you've fallen in love with after living there for a few years?
So, yeah, it's interesting because I was raised out in Colorado. I'm from Boulder originally, and slowly made my way. I lived in Iowa for a while, and then I got my PhD in Florida, moved to Georgia. But my family on my mom's side is from the South, and so I grew up eating Southern food every time I was with them. And so in some ways, getting access to Southern food more regularly has been kind of a homecoming of sorts, because my grandma, who I used to make this food with, is no longer around, and neither is my mom. And so I still have access to, like grits, like trying to get a good quality grit out in Colorado. You can do it, but it's not like here where I can just go down to whatever store and take my pick. Yeah, it's felt more like coming back in contact with things that are familiar and that I've always enjoyed, but just didn't really get to fully sink my teeth into on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love grits so much. You cannot get them where we live. Not really. There was a restaurant for a while that Muscadine. I miss it so much.
Oh, yeah.
Made the most amazing grits, and I think she just used a slow cooker to make them because they do require such long. If you get the old school grits, they just require a long time in the cooking. But they were fantastic. They just take on this creaminess that you don't have to add a lot of dairy to it for it to taste amazing, but I miss them. I really miss them so much.
Dairy never hurts.
It doesn't hurt, right?
It's true. Yeah, grits are probably one of my favorite foods. And it's funny because the foods that I'm like, oh, I love these things, when I take them over to Ireland, my husband does not like them as much. He's not a huge grits person. He doesn't like porridges in general. And he's like, grits are just a porridge, and I don't like porridges. And I'm just like, huh. But I haven't encountered anybody in my life before that just doesn't like porridge, as a class of food.
I know. I thought we all sort of liked some form of gruel or another.
Who doesn't like a good gruel?
It's comforting.
All right. So we're going to move into our tasting segment. So this week's theme is recipe writing, and in our tasting segment today, we are trying Showstopper Cookies, which is a local cookie company. And I really love how this business started. So the business owner, Andrea, perfected her chocolate chip cookie recipe over about 10 years. And then during the pandemic, she lost her job and turned her cookie recipe into a business. So she bakes large batches of these amazing chocolate chip cookies for like corporate gifts, or if you have to buy a bunch of gifts at like the holidays for, you know, your kids' teachers and just all the people in your life. They're really great for that. So we're going to try those right now, and they look so good.
They smell really good.
They smell delicious.
Oh, man.
They have
They've
got the flaky salt on top.
It's always a good sign.
And she uses locally sourced flour and eggs, and she makes her own vanilla extract, which is just really awesome, and uses Guittard chocolate, which is a very good chocolate brand. Ooh, they're really full of chocolate chips too.
Those are really good.
Yeah, they're just super buttery and they're chewy. I like that they're not crispy, but they have a nice chew to them.
I feel like salt on a cookie, especially a chocolate chip cookie, it just makes it such a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the chocolate chip cookie recipe that we did for Joy, we were developing a recipe for like a chewier chocolate chip cookie in addition to the classic one that's been in the book forever. And it's such a hard recipe to perfect. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to me that it took her 10 years to perfect the recipe, because you change the tiniest thing and it changes the outcome tremendously. That's one of my favorite and most frustrating things about baking.
And like trying to account for, you know, the kind of pan somebody's using or that kind of thing.
Differences in ovens, I think, make a huge difference sometimes.
Ambient temperature. Yeah. Sometimes I think that, you know...
It's kind of a nice segue to recipe writing and the difficulties thereof. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about how, like, you know, a lot of chocolate chip cookie recipes, they have you refrigerate the dough for at least 24 hours, if not 48 hours, which does, I think, make it for a better cookie because the flour can fully hydrate. And, you know, then it's also, you're not having to deal with the differences in different people's ambient temperatures of their house. Because, like, some people's houses are really warm, and so your cookie dough is going to be really warm and then spread a bunch and kind of run into each other and get crispy, whereas other people keep their houses colder. So it kind of takes away that variable, as well as like letting the flour get fully hydrated. I love thinking about the different tweaks you can make to a simple recipe like that can really make a huge difference.
I'm not much of a baker because of all of the things. I just get really frustrated if it doesn't work out. And I like to not follow recipes to a T. That's just like my style. So if I can find good baked goods...
Yeah.
Or just tell my husband to do it. That's
yeah, John is a good baker.
Yeah, he is, thank God. But he likes to follow recipes exactly, and I don't. So it works well in our household in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So are you literally just, you read a recipe and you're like, I'm not doing that?
Well, I'm always like, well, that needs more garlic. Like, sure. All the time. I don't know. I mean, it just kind of also, I feel like I like to just see what I have in my pantry and add different spices, and it's just more my style. And when I have to look at like a recipe to bake bread or bake cookies, I know that I can't really
that needs more baking.
I can't really do that. So
I do love baking, and I also love not following the recipe exactly.
With baking?
Even with baking, I'm trying to think of a good example of kind of going off script a little, but like I like to use a base recipe and then like maybe I'll make a cake but add swirls of jam. I don't know, something like that. So I don't necessarily follow the recipe 100% all the time, but you have to be prepared not to be mad at the recipe when you mess it up.
Right.
Because that does happen. That's a risk.
That's on you.
It's on me
at that point.
Yeah, totally. I accept responsibility for my actions.
But you follow like the basic baking powder, baking soda.
Totally.
All of that has to be followed.
Unless I'm like, there's no way. Sometimes you read a recipe and once you've been cooking long enough, you're like, that's too much baking soda. You really only need like a quarter teaspoon of baking soda per cup of flour most of the time in a recipe. So if I see an egregious amount of baking soda, I will cut it back.
Like red flags.
Yeah, it's a red flag.
It's like, was this scaled from a restaurant-sized recipe, or
yeah, that can cause weird things to happen for sure.
Or maybe that there was just like a miscommunication between the tester of the recipe and the people that were putting together the manuscript. There's like so many
of things can happen.
So many possibilities.
So let's talk briefly about last week's Joy Scouts recipe. Last week, we asked folks to make fried shallots, crispy fried shallots. Shannon, did you make them this week?
I mean, I've made these so many times, you guys. So when that was the Joy Scout recipe, I'm like, oh, darn, I guess I have to make the crispy fried shallots again. Yes, we made them. We made them last night. And then I based our dinner off of a Melissa Clark recipe it was crispy pork noodles, but we don't eat pork very often. So we used ground turkey instead. And instead of bok choy, we used cabbage, and we had shiitake mushrooms, and it was really, really it was a very comforting noodle dish, and then covered in the shallots and some like freshly torn basil and way too much chili crisp for John, not for me. And it was so good. It was really, really comforting. But the problem with the crispy fried shallots is that I can't stop eating them like while I'm finishing my meal. So
failed to see the problem.
I mean, I was like, oh, I shouldn't have had that many crispy fried shallots. I love them.
Yeah, John made them last night, and we had them on a rice bowl thing with soy sauce tofu. It's an Andrea Wen recipe that's so simple and it's kind of brilliant. Because you just cook the tofu in a skillet with a little bit of oil and soy sauce, and that's it. But you cook them until it gets a little caramelized.
Yeah.
It's so good. And then we had steamed broccoli or something. It was kind of basic, but we kind of wanted a basic.
It kind of sounds like we were in the same mood last night. It was just a vehicle for the shallots.
Yeah, exactly. John, you developed the recipe and you tested that one a bunch.
Well, yeah, we had a recipe for fried shallots in previous editions. I can't remember exactly when they were added off the top of my head for whatever reason. I ended up changing it so that there was a cornstarch dredge. And also, I feel like I lowered the frying temperature because, especially with crispy fried shallots, if you let them go for just a little bit too long, or if you have it at too high a temperature, they just start to get bitter.
Mm-hmm. Also, another key thing is to not, it's tempting to add salt to the shallots directly when they're with the cornstarch, but you got to wait until they're done and then sprinkle them after they're fried, because they will release a bunch of water, and you don't want to add wet shallots to hot oil. That's just a nightmare waiting to happen.
Well, yeah, they'll take longer to get crispy at the very least. And yeah, instead of getting dredged in a cornstarch, they're starting to sit in a batter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the recipe says flour or cornstarch. I use cornstarch. Do you guys have a preference, personally?
We use cornstarch.
Okay.
Pretty much
we use it a lot.
Always.
But, I feel like the only reason, though, is because the flour is in the garage. And the cornstarch is in the cabinet.
Right there. Yeah. Exactly.
But, flour does have a little bit more. I feel like it browns a little bit better. And you definitely get maybe a toastier flavor. Mm-hmm. It might not be quite as crispy, but
yeah, I think the cornstarch is more crisp.
Yeah,
the flour can get browner. So
maybe I'll try flour next time, just out of curiosity.
You should try side by side.
Yeah. Oh no.
And this week's recipe, which we actually just made this week, which was what made us think of it, is fish boulangèere, which sounds fancy, but it's very easy. And it's a super riffable recipe. It's just like a firm flesh white fish on top of cooked potatoes and onions. The recipe calls for pearl onions, but as we discussed last week, they are a pain in the neck to prepare. So we actually used a leek this time. We sauteed the leek first, and then did you steam or boil the potatoes, John?
I boiled them. We were definitely riffing on the recipe because, it calls for small red or gold potatoes. And I feel like the CSA, we had bigger russet potatoes. And so, yeah.
We just cut them into chunks.
Quartering them. And yeah. And then the other big change we made, that I feel like this is the second or third time that we've done it with this particular recipe. There's 2 times where you're using a little bit of melted butter to add to the potatoes and the onions, or alliums, whichever onion you want to use. So with that melted butter, you want to mix in maybe a teaspoon of white miso. So white miso is so good.
White miso makes it it takes it kind of over the top and makes it just taste more complex. You can also use a variety of fishes for this recipe. We used cod, but I think rockfish would work really well. Halibut would work well. And then haddock is another suggestion that we give in the book. But any just kind of thicker white fish. Like I wouldn't want to use a super thin like tilapia or something. Although maybe if John mentioned last night that maybe you could just stack them on top of each other.
Like little pie.
Yeah.
Just make sure that miso gets on in every layer. Good to go.
Yeah, we would love for folks to cook along with us. If you do cook this recipe, please tag us at The Joy of Cooking on Instagram and let us know how you liked it.
Fish Boulangèere is on page 380 in the 2019 edition.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I love this. It's so nice to just have a meal planned for the week already. It's great.
If you want to try Andrea's Showstopper cookies, go to showstoppercookies.com and enter JOY in all caps for 15% off. That's showstoppercookies.com. Enter JOY in all caps for 15% off.
Julia, I would love to ask you some questions. First of all, what is your relationship with the Joy of Cooking cookbook? How did you first come to the book? Was it something you grew up with, or did you only hear about it as an adult?
So I didn't really come to it until I was an adult. My mom didn't have a ton of cookbooks, and the ones she had a couple Betty Crocker cookbooks and a couple low-fat cooking kind of. She was very into the low-fat cooking lifestyle. And I had the first copy of Joy I ever got was from a thrift store when I was, I think, in my 20s. And then when the 2019 edition came out, one of my friends, Lauren, actually surprised me with a copy of it she bought right when it came out. And so I came home from, I don't know, being out and about one day, and there was a copy of it sitting on my porch waiting for me, which was great. So I've been cooking from that edition ever since.
Fantastic. Are there any recipes in it that you keep coming back to or that you've really liked?
Oh man. When I was working on my food preserving cookbook, the one that I just finished, one thing I really love about Joy and about your approach to writing is you do a really good job of balancing the need for specificity with it also being approachable. For example, because, as part of researching that book and, I had obviously preserved food before, but I hadn't, done as much with ice glazing fish or doing air displacement method for freezing or things like that. And so researching that, I found the way that you approach technique to be very useful and understandable. And it helped inform where I was like, oh, I've never done this technique before, but I can, I feel confident I can do it. And I won't mess it up too badly.
It's very, very gratifying to hear. I'm glad you find it so useful.
I'm glad you mentioned those parts of the book, because I do feel like there's this huge emphasis. I mean, it's part of it is marketing, right? Like there's this huge emphasis on the number of recipes in the book, and there are a lot of recipes in Joy of Cooking. But my favorite parts of the book and my favorite parts to work on have been the instructional or the research parts of it, or the back of the book where the Know Your Ingredients section is. Those parts were just super fun, and I feel like they're some of the hidden gems in the book that you might not even think to look for.
Yeah, definitely my favorite part of the book to work on. And it was also pretty humbling to be able to improve upon the work that luminaries of, food writing like Harold McGee and Shirley Corrier both helped us with the Know Your Ingredients portion of the book, as well as the cooking methods and techniques chapter. And so it was just really exciting to kind of engage with the work that they did and to try to improve upon it in the most responsible way that we could. So yeah, definitely fun.
Yeah. Julia, whose work, speaking of Harold McGee and Shirley Corrier, is there anyone that you really look to when you're developing recipes, especially for canning and preserving or fermenting, anyone whose work you follow?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Joy was such a good port of call for that sort of giving me inspiration for how to construct a discussion of techniques that was more approachable for my audience. Harold McGee also, of course. But because I kind of cut my teeth in the books that I wrote about food that are the most well-known are ferment books. And so I've done a lot of engagement with folks in the world of fermentation. And so Sandra Katz, is one of my big inspirations, and what I love about Sandor's work is there's an understanding of where specificity needs to exist versus where you can riff and customize and go off script. That's something I appreciate about a lot of folks who do fermentation is there's, it's like, okay, well, this brine has to be, in these certain ratios in order for this fermentation to happen. So, say for lactofermentation, it's between about 2 and 5% salinity. And you want to keep your, for sauerkraut or whatever, you want to keep it under the brine so you don't get mold, like all, these basic things. But then what you put in the sauerkraut can really be whatever you want. And I appreciate that a lot of fermentation authors do a good job of riding the line between offering that guidance and still allowing for customizability. Kirsten and Christopher Shockey are two other folks whose work I really respect and who I've been following for years. Yeah, and I've been lucky, when I wrote Our Fermented Lives, I was lucky that Sandor wrote the foreword, but also read through, obviously as part of writing the foreword, read through the book. And so I was able to get his feedback on the work, which was good, as it was my first fermentation book that was really out there in a really public way. And, it can be very terrifying to, like, even if you know something really well, to be seen and turned to as a voice of expertise in something, no matter how well you know it. So I was glad to have somebody who I look to also look at that book.
Yeah, Sandor Katz was also he's the reason that I started fermenting in college. Was I saw him at a farmer's market. He was doing a sauerkraut demo.
Oh, that's cool.
And selling copies of Wild Fermentation. And I bought a copy, and I still have the original, my first copy was like the hot pink and lime green kind of cover. Also, just reading him on fermentation was so cool because he writes about it. Like you said, there's like the technical aspect of it, but he also writes a lot about almost like fermentation as a metaphor for like culture. And I just found that so moving and fascinating. And that was kind of what piqued my interest initially. Why did fermentation first kind of appeal to you, Julia?
So, yeah, and I like that you mentioned that because that's part of, I think, why I resonate so much with his work. And I'm very happy that, he's a friend and a mentor because we both have all of these ways that fermentation enriches our lives. Yeah, I first came to it in my early 20s. I started making sauerkraut and yogurt and stuff. And initially, it was a really, like, a purely practical, I'm broke, I'm gardening to infill food because I'm food insecure, and oh no, I have all these cabbages, I have all of this food, what am I going to do? And so a friend taught me to make sauerkraut, and it kind of just ballooned from there. But I found such pleasure in it so early on, and I never would have imagined it would be something that I would be writing about and talking about and teaching. And so in November, I just opened an online culinary school, and I get to teach all these like crazy fermentation classes that I'm like, wow, I never would have imagined this was even possible. So the relationship has blossomed from just, I need to preserve my food, into this collaborative sort of, I'm creating food along with these microbes. Like we're working together to make something. And it connects me to place, it connects me to time and the local food that's available to me. It connects me to my garden. It's connected me to so many people around the world. It's such a powerful, beautiful practice.
I do love the aspect of fermentation that is, there's a wildness to it, literally and figuratively. Like you don't really know, you can't see the microbes at work, but they're working. You don't know exactly what they consist of, but you sort of have an idea. I don't know. There's just like an element of not knowing that I think, when we're cooking most of the time, we're following recipes, like some of us following them more exactly than others, but like you follow like about how much time this takes, about, how much salt it needs. And with fermentation, the time spans are kind of uncertain. Like you can give estimates, but depending on the temperature, depending on what's going on, it might take less time or more time. So I love that there's a little bit of more play in the process too. Do you find that kind of uncertainty to be, I mean, I'm assuming you find it stimulating, but maybe it's also a little stressful?
Oh, I find it very stimulating, and it's funny because I think there's an overlap between me enjoying the uncertainty and the flexibility of fermentation and like the way I approach creativity in general. Like I have this thing I always tell my writing clients where every single thing we do, like we're not failing or whatever if a piece of writing doesn't turn out exactly how we want. It's just a chance to learn. And that's true with the ferment too, right? Is if I make something and I'm like, wow, it turns out putting, I don't know, this much thyme in here makes this taste like soap. Wow, that was a terrible idea. Like I didn't fail, I just have learned a thing, right? And I think fermentation offers us, we're learning every time we ferment, no matter how long we've been doing it. Even when I make sauerkraut, and I've made sauerkraut, I don't know how many thousands of times at this point in my life, but every time I do, it's such a pleasant, not surprise, but I'm just like delighted that it works every time.
Right. I feel the same way. Like the first time I made sauerkraut, it just started bubbling and I was like, it's working. I don't know what I expected to happen, but for some reason it was almost a surprise and very delightful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's like the fact that it's alive and you can see it. I mean, it's so fun. It's so good.
It sounds like sauerkraut is a fermentation project that is good for newbies to fermentation in general. Do you have 2 or 3 other ideas of what would be good for people who are maybe feeling a little bit hesitant about getting into it or a little bit scared maybe?
Yeah, I mean, lacto-fermented vegetables are such an accessible starting place. So, you could do something like fermented carrot sticks are a very good snack. And you just pack your carrots, your raw carrot sticks in a brine that's like, say, a tablespoon of salt to a quart of water that's room temperature water. Pour that over, let it sit for a few days, and then you have fermented carrot sticks. You can do hot sauce in kind of a similar way with whole peppers and maybe some cloves of garlic and, I don't know, some herbs or spices or whatever else you want. I encourage people to start with fermented vegetables because I think it's an easy way to build confidence.
Yeah.
And then from there, you can move to other more complex ferments. But once you kind of get past that initial hesitation of working with microbes, such a welcoming world and there's such endless variety. I will spend my entire life fermenting food and I will only scratch the surface of what's possible.
Something I think about a lot is some people do need to ferment things to preserve them, but a lot of us don't really need to do it. It's something we do because we enjoy it. We enjoy the flavors. Why do you think humans have continued to ferment things even though most of us don't necessarily need it for our basic survival?
I mean, this was something interesting when I was writing Our Fermented Lives that I thought a lot about because fermentation is found in every culture, right? And it's such a part of so many of our culinary traditions. And I think part of that has to do with flavor. And with, the variety of possible ferments. I mean, so many beverages. I mean, obviously alcoholic beverages, but, fermented sodas and things as well. Fermented vegetables, misos, bread, cheese, like all these different things. There's so many familiar flavors that we would be... A huge part of our diet would go away if we didn't eat ferment. So I think that's part of it. But I think there is that... we're naturally sort of drawn to, those of us who make ferments, we're naturally drawn to that transformative process. Like there's something about working with food that transforms and that isn't just like, I cooked this and, it transformed in half an hour. It's like, no, I can't rush this. Like this is going to take the time it takes. And there's only so much I can control this. Because it is a collaboration. And I think there's something, I don't know, there's something kind of visceral and really pleasing and exciting about that maybe we don't get with other forms of cooking.
Well, I love like just in my brain, I just imagine these cute little microbes hanging out in my kitchen, like making things delicious. And I'm
Welcome
like,
to
well,
the party.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often have, like, when I go over, I have this shelf with all of my ferments on it. Started out as one shelf, and now it's like a floor to ceiling situation.
I want to see a picture of it. I'm dying to see
It's
a
like
picture
a microbe hotel.
Yeah.
It is.
Cute.
Yeah, I should send you a photo of it.
Please do.
But yeah, every time I go over there, I'm like, oh, my buddies, like they're hanging out.
Well, they are. I mean, they are alive.
Yeah.
If you've never fermented before, doing it for the first time is a little bit freaky almost because you don't really know what to expect. We do not currently have a website, but when we did, we had a sauerkraut recipe on there.
When
we will have a sauerkraut recipe.
Forthcoming.
But that one page had more comments on it than any other page, and most of them were,
"You're doing it wrong."
yeah, it was either "you're doing it, this is wrong," or "it smells funny. Is it safe?" Or "it looks weird," or like, "How do I know when it's done?" And I think the hard thing, but the thing that if you can get it in your head, it kind of, it's a light bulb moment, is that it is a flexible process. The results can differ. Also, what you're looking for is just that it tastes good to you. It's not like there's some, uber goal. It's really just, does this taste good? Do I like it? Okay, it's done. It's ready.
Yeah.
Which can be hard to wrap your mind around, though.
Yeah, it's not a question that can be answered by looking at the accompanying photo of sauerkraut. Oh, it looks right. No.
Right.
And yeah, it smells funky.
That's why it's good.
It does. And yeah, in my house, like my house always smells like sauerkraut. And so, much to the pleasure of anybody who comes over. It's just like...
Julia, what projects are you currently working on?
Right now, since it's citrus season, I've been doing a lot of preserved lemons and using, the preserved lemon technique with other citrus like tangerines and things.
Ooh.
That's been one big focus. I made a bunch of mead recently. I know there are people who get much more exacting in their mead making process. I literally just take my jar of honey after I've eaten most of the honey out of it and add room temperature water and shake it, and then shake it every day. And then eventually I have mead and I drink it.
I love that.
I've been doing that. Yeah. Very not recipe way of living.
I've only scratched the surface as far as like the literature on this, but do you know what processes are going on with preserved citrus like that, with salt preserved lemons? Because it definitely seems like it's just so dang salty that, lactic acid bacteria would have a hard time surviving.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I haven't really dove deeply into this, but my understanding is it's less about it being a fermentative process and more about the salt pulling out a lot of the water from the citrus and preserving it simply by the citrus being both having less water in it and but then being under the salty brine.
Mm-hmm.
So acidity and salinity.
Mm-hmm. Where can listeners follow you?
I am all over the internet. I have the social medias. So there's at Root Kitchens, at culinary.curiosity.school, which is the new culinary school that I mentioned. At Your Roots and Branches is if you are a writer and you want writing coaching, that is where I do that. And then at Bookish Julia is me, and that's just whatever I feel like posting. And then I have websites associated with all of those too, culinarycuriosityschool.com, root-kitchens.com, and rootsandbranches.site.
That's so many things. I'm so impressed.
Thank you. I like to stay busy. And then I also have books too.
So each week we choose a topic to tackle based on caller suggestions. And this week we're talking about recipe writing and sort of by extension recipe attribution.
I'm a farmer with a farmer's market stand selling my vegetables. People ask me how to cook my veggies. I know what I do, but I don't know how to write a recipe. Any good tips or a format? Or can I just make copies of recipes from Joy? Is that breaking the law? So many questions. Send help.
I love that question.
Yeah, it's really good.
Well, you can't copyright a recipe.
Yeah, it's true. You can't copyright a recipe. if you're asking for permission to use Joy of Cooking recipes, we're cool with it. I mean, we like farmers and we love local produce, and so definitely you can use our recipes. We love attribution. Just let people know where they come from, and if you're doing this on a website or like a newsletter, an email newsletter, including links to authors' books or their work is a really good thing to do, so that folks can support them if they want. And then this is more of like my opinion I always like it if someone's sharing a recipe, they give a little context behind why they're sharing it. Like, why do they like that recipe? Did it just sound good? Do you make it all the time? And then if you have like your own personal tweaks or preferences to the recipe, definitely share those, because it just makes it more personal and really expresses like why you're wanting to share that recipe.
Yeah, I took this as like a creative writing prompt, and now that I'm looking, it's not creative. I mean, a writing prompt, let's just put it that way. And I really don't know how to summarize it all, but yeah, some people more than others get sore about this, and I feel like if recipes have like a kind of a one weird trick, quote unquote, kind of aspect to them, then it's more likely that people will get upset unless you cite their work, especially if you're not monetizing it. I feel like the stakes are pretty low.
Mm-hmm. You had some tips on actually learning how to write recipes.
Right. I'm looking at that now, and it's hard to give advice on this.
Yeah, it's a hard process. I think reading recipes and really paying attention to the way things are worded, and then finding like if you like a certain recipe developer's style, what are they doing that you really like? And then from there, it's in a way, recipe writing is kind of technical writing, but also it's technical writing, but you can personalize it.
I kind of broke it down into like, what is your starting point? Are you trying to capture something that you've done in the kitchen, a favorite dish that you've made, more than a few times that you would really like to share? Or are you kind of setting out to write a recipe for something that you know about, that a known dish, quote unquote, that you're not, maybe less familiar with the making of it, do not have strong feelings about how it should be done. If it's the first case where you're just trying to capture, something that you have done in the kitchen like over and over again, and maybe, done variations on and riffed on, I mean, obviously the first step is to take good notes and try to think of all the elements that make the dish come off without a hitch. Obviously, well, maybe this isn't so obvious, but it feels like I've heard this over and over again and, seen it in practice over and over again. But, you should always be giving 2 indicators for when a particular cooking step is done. So, example, saute until golden brown, about 10 minutes. So there you have like visual cue as well as, a time estimate.
That's so helpful.
Yeah, pulling in like those sensory, like what should I be expecting at this phase is so helpful, because it is, I mean, no matter how many times you test a recipe or how much you revise it, ultimately when you release that recipe into the world, it's going to be encountering circumstances that you can't predict. And so, people's stoves are different, their ovens are different, their households are different.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier when, you guys were talking about how unpredictable ferments are and how you kind of have to bake that into fermenting recipes. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like, that kind of uncertainty is kind of baked into all recipes. And the ones that are not, about a magical fermentation process, it's less obvious. But yeah, there's so many different variables and contingencies, like differences between kitchens, obviously ambient temperature, like you were talking about for the chocolate chip cookies. But yeah, trying to actually, I hesitate to use the word empathy, but, trying to empathetically think about how people are going to be encountering your recipe, and then trying to think of ways that they could mess up, or even just taking notes on when you've messed up, and then trying to, write the recipe, not necessarily like trying to head off every single, mistake that somebody makes, but just having that in mind and giving a level of detail in the recipe that is not so exacting that it's going to piss people off and keep them from actually cooking what you're writing about. But also, just enough to get people like going in the right direction.
And then also, once you've written the recipe, giving it to someone else and having them make it and encounter things that you didn't think of. I had a teacher in high school who sometimes he would tell these stories. I was never sure if they were true or not. But he said that one time he was teaching a writing class to, like, this is high schoolers, and he asked everyone to write, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then he bought a loaf of bread and some peanut butter and jelly and sat at the front of the classroom reading people's stories about how to make peanut butter and jelly, and made the sandwiches according to how they described it and how each one was a little different. And some of them were not peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at all. And I still think about that, because when you write a recipe, that recipe is going to ultimately be in someone else's hands, and they are going to read it in a way that is unique to them. Which is part of the challenge of the thing, but also what makes it kind of fun, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Julia, you should chime in. I feel like you probably have a lot to say about recipe writing.
Yeah, no, this is interesting because, like, I mean, you guys can't see me, but I'm sitting here, like, nodding my head as you're talking through all of this. But yeah, no, it's interesting because I actually have been thinking a lot in the last year about where my recipe writing fits into the larger sort of constellation of recipe writing, because of course the way that we have formatted recipes has changed over time, and when left to my own devices, I tend to write in more of the pre-industrial revolution style way that's like a paragraph of me being like, yeah, just like throw some things together, and then when it's done, okay. And that works for me, because if I'm making, say, sauerkraut, and I've made it 1,000 times, I know when it tastes like sauerkraut to me and it tastes good, it's done. But having to articulate that to a reader who's never made it before, you really have to build in a lot of encouragement that it's okay to trust your intuition. Because I think one of the challenges I encounter with recipe writing is, again, providing that specificity, because there are things that you do need to be specific about, but then encouraging people to also sort of pivot away from the recipe when they feel called to, if it's something that's not going to mess up the safety or whatever of the recipe.
And that aspect of it too, I love, because that to me is what made me fall in love with cooking, was getting to start to play. And then it stops being just this dry process to get dinner on the table. It's like a creative exercise.
It stops feeling like homework in that sense. Yeah.
That reconnecting to that sense of play, and to it reduces some of the stakes too. Like it makes it less of a, like, I'm going to mess up and get it wrong, and more of a, I'm going to experiment and see what I can do to make this recipe something that kind of has my own fingerprints on it too. And so it's a collaboration with the author, rather than just being like, this person wrote this thing, and if I don't do it perfectly, it's like I messed up at homework and I'm terrible.
I do like thinking of it as a collaborative effort, because it kind of at least captures that there's a dynamic going on, not only between, the text and the author, and then the text and the reader, but also there's complications on both sides of that equation, where just the whole process of, maybe this is true of like all instructional writing, but with cooking in particular, just because there's like the subjectivity of taste involved. It just, the whole thing just seems, I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, like from a theory perspective, but it is really interesting to me how do you replicate this process or this dish, through all of these different steps of interpretation and reproduction. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I feel like I'd be remiss not to mention that we talked about this a little bit on the history episode, but, in the 1930s, Irma Rombauer invented a new style of recipe writing, which before, there was that early style of recipe writing, which is kind of just a paragraph, and it's like, make pie crust, and then it's very light on detail. And then there was kind of the Fanny Farmer school, which was very, very exact, but you ultimately have your ingredients at the top, and then you have your steps. And then Irma took that and interspersed them, so the ingredients are embedded in the recipe, and it reads more like a narrative. And I love, when I first came to Joy of Cooking as an adult, I had never seen recipes written like that before, and it took a minute to kind of wrap my head around it. It's different. But I love that the ingredients are in context of how they're used. When you're reading a recipe through for the first time before you make it, if all the ingredients are at the top, you're going back and forth constantly, and it's a little bit choppy. It's hard to kind of wrap your brain around the recipe, but the way this is called the action method, the way Joy's recipes are written, you can kind of read it almost like a little story.
Yeah, you never lose your place. You're never like, oh, I have to go back down to the step. Oh, I have to go back to the, it kind of, the standard way of writing recipes implies, or just assumes that you have prepared all of your ingredients, before you even start cooking. And, obviously that's ideal. There are plenty of times where I found myself like doing prep while I cook because it just makes the most sense to do that. Because, otherwise
time.
you're twiddling your thumbs like, okay, I guess I don't know.
Stand with these onions for 10 minutes while they saute.
I love staring at onions, as we all know. But yeah.
I also do love this recipe writing method because it avoids certain issues for the recipe developer as well. It's really hard to forget to include an ingredient because it's going right there in line. It's not in a separate place and divided. You know how some recipes will have like 6 tablespoons of butter divided, and then, sometimes they'll forget to call for the rest of it or the amounts won't be right. And I feel like with the action method, it's just harder to mess that up because you're not having to describe, oh, well, you're dividing this amount and you're only adding 2 tablespoons here and 4 tablespoons here. So I think it's a little easier. Once you get used to that style, it's easier for the reader and easier for the writer as well. Julia, what do you think about action method versus like the ingredients at the top kind of standard recipe format?
The way my publisher wants me to write them is the standard recipe with the ingredients at the top. I think both have their place. I usually write in that sort of standard way just because it's how I've been trained to write. But I like the action method because, like you said, it's more when we think about that collaboration and that like narrative, like it's like I'm reading a book that I get to like cook along with, as opposed to I have been given a homework assignment with steps. And that's something when I'm developing recipes, it's one thing that's kind of interesting to go back and forth with my editor on is I'll have some more narrative and stuff in the text, in the steps, and she sometimes encourages me to pare that down a little bit because I'm just like, yeah, you can like do this and like try this and whatever, and she's like, no, we just need you to say, and this is when you add the onions, like you don't just like too much waxing poetic, and so it's interesting. I liked what you said, though, about it also including contextualizing features like the multiple ways of testing doneness. That's true across all formats, but I think that's sort of like anything you can do to contextualize for the reader and make them feel like they can envision themselves going from start to finish with this dish rather than it being like this choppy sort of disjointed experience, I think is a service to the reader.
I like the point you brought up, which is that, editors and publishers have certain expectations of what a recipe looks like. And I think that's really true on the internet.
Yeah,
websites
that's what I was about to say.
Like as we've been working with a developer and a designer on a website for a while, and one of the biggest things we wanted to ensure was that we could have the recipes be an action method because that's how Joy of Cooking recipes are. But you have to build a custom recipe module to do that. You can't just, most recipe plugins are the ingredients at the top and the steps at the bottom.
The entire internet is against us.
I know.
It sounds like you'll be making a very useful plugin for perhaps more than just yourselves.
If you have a topic, ingredient, or joy story to share, call our hotline at 503-395-8858. Leave us a message or send us a text. We'd love to hear from you. Next week's topic comes from our caller.
My aunt had a New Year's party and made Irma's gin and juice. She said the recipe is in the book, but mine is all packed up. Can you tell me how to make it?
Looking forward to answering that one and maybe getting to have a cocktail as our tasting segment
on a Sunday morning.
All right. So what is everybody thinking about for this week? What are you going to be cooking or eating or enjoying this week?
I'll be making our Joy Scout recipe
Very
for
nice.
one dinner, obviously. That's great. I work at an office sometimes, and we sign up to bring in Thursday treats. And I think I'm going to make the Joy's banana bread.
Ooh, yes.
And bring in some other stuff too. But we had it when we were camping recently, and it was so good. The dried apricots in it.
Oh yeah, the apricots. It makes it.
It's so good. And I think we're also just going to do a baked potato night. That's kind of our phone it in dinner sometimes. And we've got a concert, I think on Thursday night. So we'll probably do baked potatoes before that. And different toppings. I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love a baked potato bar situation.
Oh, it's the best.
It's the best.
What about you two?
Well, my sister is visiting, so it's really just an excuse to go to all of our favorite places in Portland.
Nice.
So we're probably going to go to our favorite pizza place, Lovely's 50/50. The chef, Sarah Minnick, she uses, it's very, like, I try to describe it as Pacific Northwest pizza because it's all the vegetables that she uses are from the farmer's market, and they're very seasonal. And so, like, even in the winter, in the pizzas that have tomato on them, it's like a fermented tomato sauce that she makes in the summer. It's so good. And then she uses, like, really nice fancy cheeses that you don't normally get on pizzas, and the dough is like a sourdough, so the
dough is really
good,
good,
so good. Yeah. And all the salads are, anyway, that's happening this week for sure.
Yeah, basically we're just going to pretend like we're tourists in our own town.
I love that.
It's so fun. Thanks for listening to the Joy of Cooking podcast. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by subscribing to the show and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. Follow us at joyofcooking.substack.com and on Instagram at thejoyofcooking. Stay tuned for next week, where we will tackle cocktails. And don't forget to make this week's recipe cod Boulangèere. Call in with questions, hopes, history, or where you find joy in the kitchen. Our number is 503-395-8858. That's 503-395-8858.
And we could not do this without our fantastic team at the Joy of Creation production house. Thank you to Dave Drusky, our production coordinator, Haley Bowers, our audio engineer, and this week it was Dirk Marshall, our producer.